My name is Yancy Mejia, and I am a co-managing editor for HJSR's 2016. We are very proud to feature you in this special issue of HJSR, Sexuality in the Post-Marriage Equality Era. Dr. Salvador Vidal-Ortiz is an associate professor for the Department of Sociology at American University in Washington, D.C. He is an inspirational scholar who has contributed to the interdisciplinary topics of race, gender, sexuality, including religion. His book, entitled The Sexuality of Migration, was an ASA 2010 Distinguished Award winner in the Sexualities and Latino Studies. He recently co-edited Queer Brown Voices with Leticia Gomez and Uriel Quesada, which is an oral history book of personal narratives that challenges the Eurocentric grand narratives of the queer movement in the United States, as it has systematically excluded the contributions of queer brown activists. On that note, a few scholars, including yourself, have explored how queer rights agendas have been set by a privileged few, as exemplified by the book Queer Brown Voices. With this special issue of HJSR, we wanted to ask, what's next? Related to this, I'd like to ask you a few questions. First, how has the focus on marriage equality impacted queer rights?
Well, I'm very honored to be here. I'm really happy that you're doing this interview with me. For me, queer rights have been articulated in a way, especially through gays in the military and more recently same-sex marriage, in an agenda that only impacts a few. So for me, the first thing we should do is make a distinction between gay and lesbian or LGBT rights, which are often those rights sought by primarily gays and lesbians, versus queer rights. And for me, accessing the military or being engaged in advocacy for same-sex marriage are important goals that only benefit a fraction of the LGBT community. They are projects that help LGBT community members assimilate into a mainstream culture, and in that sense, they are not queer. They are projects of LGBT or gay and lesbian rights, not queer rights. Projects on queer rights may imply understanding the multiple layers of identification that members of the LGBT community have that incorporate not only sexuality, but gender identity and expression, class, race, ability, etc.
I think it was important that you mentioned the difference between queer and LGBTQ. As I understand it, you were trying to express that queer is more of a resistance.
Absolutely. Queer exists not just as a shorthand, which is the common usage that we see LGBT people adhere to, not just as a shorthand for LGBT people, but it exists to be able to speak to resistance to instances that try to consolidate LGBT participation into a citizenry that erases our differences. In the 70s and 80s, gay and lesbian activists fought for an inclusion that meant assimilation to existing structures. At the same time, AIDS and other events impacted a lot of the LGBT community in ways that made them realize that they did not need to become equal, that they wanted to be able to resist the structures that wanted to incorporate them without recognizing the kind of political work that being queer, wanting to resist all forms of normativity evoked.
Thank you. Adding to that question as well, how do you think it has changed queer research?
That's an excellent question, because my sense is that when we think about research, we have to think not only about methodology and techniques of data collection, we have to think about theory and conceptual frameworks. And one of the conceptual lenses we've used to think about same-sex marriage and gays in the military has been a very limiting one, which is a framework of equality. We've thought that gays and lesbians deserve everything that heterosexual counterparts get, therefore we should have access to X, Y, and Z benefits. in queer research that is really trying to be intersectional, that's trying to think of a queer set of politics, what we want to do is think about the participation of the exclusion and the inequality of people who are LGBT and the layers that create that inequality. It isn't the same to think about gays or lesbians who are white, cisgender, wealthy or well-to-do, highly educated, versus thinking of trans women of color in particular, who may have been, who may be homeless, who may have been kicked out of their homes, undereducated, underemployed, or unemployed, or forced to work in sexual work, and who do not have access to healthcare, who do not have access to decent housing. All of those things merit that we think about the framework of inequality, not the framework of equality.
I think that was powerful because it's more of thinking of the research in the frame of liberation. Mm-hmm. And that means liberation outside of systems of oppression. And in order to actually research that topic outside of the systems of oppression that guide our research in a not in a much deeper level, but in a way that it's not, at the forefront.
That's right. I think that there's a difference between a scholarship or research that wants to evoke equality for all, which is very superficial and only a few can access, and on the other hand, a scholarship for social justice that's really looking at what is underpinning the inequality that people face.
Thank you. My last question would be, where do we go from here?
That's an excellent way of closing. My sense is that we have to interrogate whiteness and the impact that it has in the agenda setting, right? In the ways in which gays in the military and then same-sex marriage agendas have been formulated, they have incorporated the very few people who have been privileged, primarily cisgender, white, gay or lesbian identified, with the means to be able to succeed in U.S. American society, irrespective of their sexual orientation. And I think queering the lens of how we think about rights and the need for a very different agenda implies that we interrogate the place of whiteness in setting that agenda to begin with. So that when we think about trans people, when we think about immigration, when we think about issues, again, of housing and health, which are critical issues still for a lot of members of the LGBT community, then we're actually thinking about a larger scope of research and creating a truly more inclusive agenda.
Thank you. What I would like to say in my reflection is that it's very important what you mentioned, because it is like an exclusionary ideology or idea, and we have to be more inclusive of all the intersectionalities that come from living in a social world that is very diverse, and that we lived in a world that is very structural and replicates inequalities in that sense as well. Thank you so much for your...
Thank you for giving me the forum to talk with you.
You're welcome. We really appreciate it, and I'm very excited to have met you.
Likewise. We're going to go party now.